The morning Daniel Voss finally agreed to tear down his grandfather's barn, half the county thought they had won. Some laughed, some shook their heads and said, "About time." Others simply drove a little slower past the Voss farm, hoping to catch the first swing of the excavator. For 15 years, people had asked the same question. Why is he keeping that useless old barn? No one had ever gotten an answer, and Daniel had stopped trying to explain, because the truth was he didn't have one. Not one he could prove. Not one that made sense. Only a feeling he had carried since he was 19 years old. That feeling had already cost him thousands of dollars, strained his relationship with his younger brother, and turned him into the subject of endless conversations at the diner in Harmon County, Kansas. People didn't think he was dangerous. They thought he was foolish. The old barn leaned toward the north after nearly a century of Kansas wind. Several roof panels had been patched with mismatched sheets of tin. Every spring, Daniel replaced another warped board. Every winter, he paid another insurance bill for a building that stored nothing anyone actually needed. To everyone else, it looked like a monument to stubbornness. By 6 o'clock that Tuesday morning, Daniel was beginning to wonder if they had been right all along. The demolition papers lay on his kitchen table. A single signature was all it would take. Across from him sat his wife, Sarah, wrapping both hands around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She hadn't tried to change his mind, not once. In 15 years of marriage, Sarah had learned there were some battles a person had to finish inside themselves. Daniel picked up the pen. His hand stopped halfway to the paper. Through the kitchen window, he could see the barn, the same weathered gray walls, the same sagging roof, the same north wall he found himself staring at every single morning. He closed his eyes and signed his name. For the first time in 15 years, the barn no longer belonged to tomorrow. It belonged to memory. Daniel would spend the rest of that day telling himself he'd made the right decision. He almost believed it. If you've ever kept a promise you couldn't explain, one that cost you money and reputation, and nearly the people who loved you, and you kept it anyway, until doubt finally won, hit like right now. You already know what that morning felt like. Because Daniel Voss had just given up on the one thing his grandfather ever asked of him. Subscribe to find out if he gave up one day too soon. Word spread faster than Daniel expected. By breakfast, someone had already mentioned it at Miller's feed store. By lunchtime, 2 farmers joked that they ought to buy lawn chairs and watch the old thing come down. "That barn has survived longer than some marriages around here," one of them laughed. "Only because Daniel's too sentimental to finish what should have been done years ago," the other grinned back. Neither man meant any real harm. Small towns have a way of turning other people's lives into shared entertainment. By afternoon, even Boyd Pruitt heard the news. Boyd had spent 3 years trying to buy 11 acres along the western edge of the property, and every offer came with the same condition: the barn has to go. He called Daniel before sunset. "I hear you're finally making the smart decision," he said. Daniel looked out the window again. "I already signed." "Good," Boyd said, not hiding his satisfaction. "I'll have another offer ready once it's down." Daniel thanked him politely, then ended the call. For reasons he couldn't explain, he still hadn't told the demolition company to begin. That evening, his younger brother Marcus stopped by the farm. Marcus walked around the barn once without saying a word, then found Daniel standing beside the north wall. "You really going through with it?" Daniel nodded. "I think I have to." Marcus looked at the weathered boards. "I wish Grandpa had let us build something practical before he passed." Daniel smiled faintly. He probably would have called steel barns ugly. Marcus laughed. "Yeah, he probably would have." For a moment, they simply stood together. Then Marcus sighed. "You know, people aren't laughing because they hate you. They're laughing because they don't understand." He kicked a loose stone across the yard. "And honestly, I don't either." The truth was, Daniel didn't understand himself, not completely. If someone had asked him why he'd spent nearly $10,000 keeping an empty barn standing, he couldn't have answered. If someone asked why he'd turned down enough money to clear the farm's equipment debt, he couldn't explain that either. Logic had abandoned this decision years ago. Only loyalty remained. Loyalty to a promise he wasn't even sure he'd made. 24 years earlier, Daniel had been 19 years old, and his grandfather, Everett Voss, had only days left to live. The old farmer wasn't a man who wasted words. Even healthy, conversations with him were measured in sentences instead of stories. That afternoon, Everett asked Daniel to pull his chair closer. For nearly 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Everett looked toward the bedroom window. "The farm will test you." Daniel smiled. "I know." Everett slowly shook his head. "No, you don't." Another silence passed. Then, almost in a whisper, Everett said, "I put everything I learned inside the north wall." Daniel frowned. Everett reached out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let anyone tear that barn down until the farm tells you it's time." Daniel waited for an explanation. None came. Everett closed his eyes and the conversation ended there. At 19, Daniel assumed the morphine had carried his grandfather somewhere memory couldn't follow. He never mentioned those words to anyone, not his parents, not Marcus, not even Sarah after they married. As the years passed, he almost convinced himself he'd imagined them. Almost. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel was helping clear out Everett's bedroom. Most of what remained fit into ordinary boxes: work shirts, receipts, a pocket watch that hadn't worked in years. Then he picked up the old family Bible. Inside the front cover, written in Everett's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words. North Wall. Ready. Nothing else. No explanation. No map. No instructions. Just 3 words. Daniel closed the Bible and quietly placed it back on the shelf. He never opened the wall, because opening it somehow felt like breaking a promise before he understood it. For 24 years, those 3 words followed him. Every insurance payment, every rejected loan, every argument with Marcus, every offer from Boyd Pruitt, every time neighbors joked about the old barn, every time Sarah gently asked, "Are you sure?" He would look toward the north wall and hear his grandfather's voice. "Until the farm tells you it's time." But how does a farm tell a man anything? That was the question Daniel had been asking himself right up until the morning he signed the demolition papers. And he still had no answer. What he didn't know was that less than 24 hours later, his phone would ring, and the woman on the other end of the line had spent the last 2 years unknowingly searching for his grandfather's secret. Daniel almost ignored the call. The number wasn't saved in his phone, and for a moment he watched it ring, expecting another salesman or another contractor confirming Thursday's demolition. Instead, a calm woman's voice introduced herself. "Mr. Voss?" "Yes. My name is Dr. Calloway. I'm a historian at the State University." Daniel frowned. "I believe I've come across something connected to your grandfather." Everett Voss. Silence. "I know this is unexpected," she continued, "but I understand your barn is scheduled for demolition." Daniel looked through the kitchen window. The old building stood exactly where it always had. "It is. I'd like to ask you for one favor." "What kind of favor?" "If there's any possibility of delaying the demolition for one day, I'd appreciate the chance to visit your property." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "Why?" There was a brief pause. "Because I think your grandfather left behind something far more important than an old barn." 200 miles away, Dr. Calloway had spent the last 2 years buried beneath boxes of forgotten government records. She wasn't searching for Everett Voss specifically. She had been researching why a handful of farms survived the Dust Bowl better than everyone around them. Most explanations were predictable: access to water, different soil, financial support. But one farm refused to fit any of them. The Voss farm. Crop reports from the late 1930s consistently showed healthier yields than neighboring properties, nothing extraordinary, just consistently better. Better through drought, better through dust storms, better through years that forced hundreds of families to abandon everything. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep bothering her. Researchers learned to trust that feeling. Sometimes the smallest inconsistency is the doorway to the biggest discovery. 3 days earlier, inside the National Archives, Dr. Calloway had opened a faded government file no one appeared to have touched in decades. The cover read, Agricultural Survey, Kansas Drought Counties, 1937. Most reports looked identical: soil conditions, rainfall, crop failures, livestock losses. Then she reached one written by a federal agricultural inspector named T.J. Whitfield. Near the bottom of the final page, one sentence caught her attention. Farmer declined to demonstrate cultivation methods. Incooperative. She read it again. It wasn't the word itself, it was where it appeared. Every struggling farm nearby had pages of recommendations. The Voss report barely filled 2 sheets. No explanation, no methodology, no details. Just that one line. Dr. Calloway leaned back in her chair. Most people would have moved on. She didn't, because farmers facing starvation usually don't refuse help, unless they're protecting something. Finding the current owner wasn't difficult. Property records led to Daniel Voss, and county tax records confirmed the farm remained in the family. Then came the shock: a local permit filed 2 weeks earlier, scheduling demolition. Dr. Calloway checked the date twice. Thursday. Tomorrow. If there was anything left, she had less than 24 hours. Back in Harmon County, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the call. By evening, he finally told Sarah, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked only one question. Do you believe her? I don't know. Do you believe your grandfather? Daniel looked toward the barn. I've spent 24 years trying to answer that. Sarah smiled softly. Then maybe tomorrow is how you find out. Convincing Marcus proved much harder. No, he said, before Daniel had even finished explaining. The crew is already booked. I only need 1 day. You've needed 1 more day for 15 years. Daniel didn't argue. Marcus kept going. We've paid insurance. We've turned down buyers. We've delayed repairs on equipment. We've carried debt because of that building. And now, because one historian calls, you want to do it again? Daniel remained quiet. Marcus rubbed both hands across his face. I love you. You know that. But if nothing's in that wall, this has to end. Daniel nodded. I know. Marcus exhaled. You've got until tomorrow evening. No more. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. Daniel stood alone in the yard long after the truck disappeared down the road. Marcus wasn't wrong. He'd never been wrong. That was what made it so hard to hear. If you've ever had the person who loves you most finally say, enough, not out of anger, but because they'd run out of patience waiting for you to be right, hit like right now. You know exactly how quiet a yard gets after that. Because Daniel had less than 1 day left to prove 24 years of faith wasn't foolish. Subscribe to find out if 1 day was enough. The next morning, Dr. Calloway arrived carrying 2 notebooks, a camera, and a leather satchel that looked older than she was. She wasn't what Daniel expected. No television documentary excitement, no dramatic introductions. She studied the farm quietly, the fields, the windbreak, the position of the barn against the prevailing winds. She asked practical questions. When was the roof last replaced? Has anyone altered the north wall? Any flood damage? Has the foundation shifted? Finally they reached the barn. Dr. Calloway stood before the north wall without touching it, just looking, longer than seemed necessary. What are you seeing? Daniel asked. She smiled slightly. I'm trying to see what your grandfather saw. They spent nearly an hour walking through the building. Everything looked ordinary. Old stalls, broken harness hooks, dust floating through shafts of sunlight. Then Daniel mentioned something he had never told anyone outside his family. My grandfather said he put everything he learned inside the north wall. Dr. Calloway stopped walking. What exactly did he say? Daniel repeated every word he could remember, then told her about the Bible. 3 words. North wall. Ready. Dr. Calloway's expression changed. Not excitement, recognition. I've seen something like this before. Daniel stared at her. Where? Not here. Another farm, different county. A hidden compartment. But when they opened it, it was empty. She took one slow step toward the weathered boards. If your grandfather built one too. And if no one's opened it, We may be standing in front of something that's waited almost 90 years. Neither of them spoke. The barn suddenly felt much quieter than before. Outside, the sound of an engine echoed across the gravel road. Daniel stepped to the doorway. A pickup truck pulled into the yard, not Marcus, not Boyd Pruitt. It was the demolition foreman. He climbed out, clipboard in hand. "I was in the area," he called. "Thought I'd stop by. We've got a storm system moving in Thursday, so we're thinking of starting first thing tomorrow morning instead." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Tomorrow morning, not Thursday. Tomorrow. He looked back at Dr. Calloway, then at the north wall. For the first time in 24 years, waiting was no longer an option. The demolition foreman wasn't trying to pressure Daniel, he was trying to help. "If the storm hits before we get started," he explained, "my crew could be tied up for another week. I'd rather get your job done while the weather's still holding." Daniel glanced at the barn. 24 hours earlier, he would have thanked the man. Now those same words felt like a countdown. "Can you give me until tomorrow afternoon?" Daniel asked. The foreman checked his clipboard. "I can, but after that, my schedule's locked." Daniel nodded. "Tomorrow afternoon." The foreman climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging over the gravel road. For a long moment, neither Daniel nor Dr. Calloway spoke. Finally, Dr. Calloway broke the silence. "If there's anything in that wall, tomorrow is the last day it exists exactly as your grandfather left it." That evening, Marcus returned. He had expected to find Daniel packing old tools or clearing the barn. Instead, he found ladders leaning against the north wall. A pry bar, flashlights, a camera. "What are you doing?" he asked. Daniel looked at him. "I'm opening it." Marcus folded his arms. "So that's it. You've finally decided." Daniel nodded. "I should have done this years ago." Marcus let out a short laugh. "I've been saying that for 15 years. "No," Daniel replied quietly. "You've been saying tear it down. I said open it." The brothers looked at one another. Then, to Marcus's surprise, Daniel handed him the pry bar. "If I'm wrong, I'll help you tear it down tomorrow." Marcus looked at the tool in his hands. "And if you're right?" Daniel turned toward the wall. "I honestly don't know." They agreed to wait until dawn, not because it mattered, but because somehow opening the wall in daylight felt respectful. Neither brother slept much. Daniel spent most of the night sitting on the porch, staring toward the silhouette of the barn beneath a sky crowded with stars. He thought about Everett, about the promise, about all the years he had spent protecting something he couldn't explain. By sunrise, there would be an answer, one way or another. The next morning arrived cool and still. Sarah carried a thermos of coffee into the barn. Marcus brought tools. Dr. Calloway unpacked gloves, notebooks, evidence bags, and a camera. No one spoke much. The north wall stood before them, weathered, ordinary, silent. Marcus slid the flat end of the pry bar beneath the first board and paused. "You sure?" Daniel nodded once. The nail groaned as it pulled free. Then another. Then another. The first plank eased away from the wall. Nothing, only old framing timber. Marcus looked at Daniel. "Told you. Keep going," Dr. Calloway said quietly. The second board came loose. Still nothing. The third, then the fourth. Suddenly the sound changed. Instead of solid resistance, the pry bar struck something hollow. Marcus froze. Everyone heard it, a deep, wooden echo. Dr. Calloway stepped closer. Again, he tapped the wall once more. The same sound, not the sound of insulation, not the sound of empty framing. A compartment, hidden behind the boards. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. For the first time, his grandfather's words no longer sounded impossible. Removing the remaining boards took another 20 minutes. The old nails fought every inch, and twice weathered wood split before it came free. By the time the final plank dropped onto the barn floor, morning sunlight reached into a space no one had seen in almost 90 years. No one moved. The compartment was smaller than Daniel expected, built neatly between the wall studs, roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, just deep enough to hold several carefully arranged bundles. Everything had been wrapped in waxed canvas. Dust covered every surface, but remarkably, almost nothing had collapsed. "It was sealed," Dr. Calloway whispered. "Your grandfather sealed the entire cavity. The airflow, the wax. He wasn't hiding something. He was preserving it." Marcus leaned closer. "I thought we'd find old tools." Instead, they saw 6 glass jars, 3 small tin boxes, a rolled-up bundle tied with faded cord, and beneath everything else, a cloth-bound journal. Daniel recognized it immediately, not because he had seen it before, but because he recognized the handwriting on its cover. Everett Voss. His grandfather had written his own name, slowly, carefully, as though he expected someone else to find it someday. Daniel reached toward it, then stopped. "I can't." Dr. Calloway looked at him. "Why not?" "It feels," he searched for the words, "like opening his grave." Sarah gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said softly. "It feels like keeping your promise." Daniel lifted the journal. The leather cracked as it opened. The first several pages were stuck together. Moisture had found its way into one corner decades earlier. Dr. Calloway carefully separated them. Some writing had faded completely. Other sections remained perfectly clear. "It's damaged," Marcus said. Dr. Calloway nodded, "but not destroyed." She turned another page. More writing. Field sketches, dates, rainfall records, soil notes. Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds like Grandpa." Then Dr. Calloway stopped turning pages. She had reached the first intact entry. Her eyes widened. She read silently, then looked up. "I think you should read this yourself." Daniel took the journal. Written across the page, in Everett's careful handwriting, were the words, "If you're reading this, the barn is still standing." Good. That means at least one person in this family learned something more important than farming. They learned patience. Daniel swallowed hard. The barn fell completely silent. Even Marcus looked away. Beneath those first lines, Everett had written one more sentence, short, simple, but it changed the story completely. "Everything inside this wall belongs to more than our family." Dr. Calloway frowned. "What does he mean?" Daniel turned the page. Several pages had been ruined by moisture. Whole paragraphs disappeared beneath faded ink. Then another intact section. Everett had underlined the first line twice. "If these seeds are ever planted again, tell the truth about where they came from." No explanation. No names. Not yet. Only another mystery. Dr. Calloway slowly closed the journal. "I don't think this is just a farming journal." Daniel looked back into the compartment. There were still unopened jars, 3 sealed tin boxes, and the rolled bundle tied with old cord. Whatever Everett had hidden, they had only just begun to uncover. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the Kansas plains. The storm was arriving earlier than anyone expected. The thunder was still miles away, but out on the plains, distance could be deceptive. A storm that looked an hour away could be on top of you in 20 minutes. Daniel stepped to the barn door and looked west. Dark clouds were gathering along the horizon. When he turned back, Dr. Calloway was already photographing every item exactly as it had been found. "Before we move anything else," she said, "we document it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think it's that important?" Dr. Calloway looked at him. "I think your grandfather wanted whoever found this to understand the story, not just the objects." The first tin box contained nothing anyone expected. Not gold, not cash, not deeds. Inside were dozens of folded papers, each carefully dated. Letters, some written by Everett, others addressed to him. Many had become too brittle to unfold safely, but one near the top remained intact. It wasn't signed. It contained only a few lines. "The beans survived again. Plant the squash 2 weeks later this time. The ground will hold its moisture longer." Marcus frowned. "Who's it from?" "No name," Dr. Calloway replied. "But whoever wrote it knew exactly what your grandfather was doing." She carefully set it aside. "We'll come back to it." The second tin box held hand-drawn field maps, not one, dozens. Every field on the property had been sketched by hand over nearly 15 years, each carrying notes in the margins. Too much shade. Plant after clover. Leave this section untouched. It wasn't random. It was a record of trial and error, failure after failure, season after season. Marcus slowly turned one of the maps over in his hands. I always thought Grandpa just knew what to do. Dr. Calloway smiled. No, he learned, and he wrote down every mistake. The third tin box was the smallest. Inside lay a faded leather pouch. Daniel loosened the drawstring, and several kernels of corn rolled into his palm. Unlike the seeds inside the jars, these had turned black with age. Dr. Calloway examined one closely. They're gone. They'll never grow. Daniel looked disappointed. So they were all for nothing? She gently shook her head. No, dead seeds can still tell stories. It was the rolled bundle that changed everything. The cord snapped as Daniel untied it, revealing a large sheet of heavy paper, a map, but not of the farm. Of planting patterns. Rows intersected at unusual angles. Different crops appeared together instead of separately. Symbols filled the margins. Marcus stared at it. This isn't how Grandpa planted. No, Daniel answered quietly. It isn't. Dr. Calloway spread the map across an old workbench. The more she studied it, the more puzzled she became. This is decades ahead of its time. What do you mean? She looked up. Modern regenerative agriculture uses ideas like this. Building soil naturally, reducing water loss, companion planting. But this map predates most published research. Marcus folded his arms. So Grandpa figured all that out himself? Dr. Calloway didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the journal again. Several damaged pages later, she found another readable section and began to read aloud. If anyone ever praises me for these fields, correct them. These ideas did not begin with me. They belonged to people who understood this land long before I did. I only listened. Silence settled over the barn. Dr. Calloway turned another page. This one had survived almost perfectly, and her voice grew quieter. The Redcorn family showed me how the earth rested. They taught me what to plant together. They showed me which seeds remembered dry years better than others. Without them, we would have lost this farm. Daniel looked at Marcus. Neither brother had ever heard the name before. Dr. Calloway carefully closed the journal. The Redcorns were an Osage family. Marcus blinked. You know them? I know of them, she said. There are records of several Osage farming families living and working across this region before and during the early Dust Bowl years. But I've never seen one credited like this. Daniel frowned. Why hide it? Dr. Calloway answered almost immediately. Because of the time. She looked toward the open barn door. In the 1930s, many Indigenous families were ignored when their knowledge worked, or dismissed when it challenged accepted farming methods. And sometimes their ideas were taken without their names. Daniel looked back at his grandfather's handwriting. He suddenly understood why Everett had written one sentence so carefully. Everything inside this wall belongs to more than our family. It wasn't humility. It was responsibility. Then Sarah noticed something everyone else had missed. One of the glass jars had a small paper label wrapped around its neck. The writing nearly faded away. She held it toward the light. I think there's another word here. Daniel stepped closer. Soil? Dr. Calloway shook her head. No, she smiled. It's a name. Carefully, she brushed away nearly 90 years of dust. The ink became clearer. Redcorn selection number 4. No one spoke. Even the seed jar itself had been labeled so the true source would never be forgotten. Everett hadn't intended to keep the knowledge forever. He had intended to protect it until the world was ready to hear where it came from. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain struck the barn roof. Seconds later, the sky opened. Rain hammered against the old boards. Wind pushed through gaps in the siding. The lights flickered, then the power went out, leaving only the gray daylight spilling through the barn doors. Marcus looked toward the wall. If we'd waited until tomorrow, this would have been under an excavator. For the first time since childhood, Marcus reached over and squeezed his brother's shoulder. You were right to wait. Daniel looked down at the journal in his hands, then slowly shook his head. No, I wasn't waiting for the wall. I was waiting until I was finally ready to open it. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside the old barn, 90 years of silence had finally come to an end. And waiting in the remaining sealed jars was one final question no journal could answer. Would the seeds still grow? The rain lasted 2 days. By the time the skies cleared, the demolition permit had expired. Daniel called the contractor. I'm not tearing it down. The foreman laughed softly. I had a feeling that was coming. He wished Daniel well and crossed the job off his schedule. Just like that, the old barn had been given another chance. Over the next several weeks, the discovery spread far beyond Harmon County, not because Daniel called the newspapers, but because Dr. Calloway insisted on doing things carefully. The journal was photographed, preserved, and compared against county records. The field maps were analyzed alongside historical aerial surveys. The surviving seed jars were cataloged one by one. The results surprised even her. 4 of the 6 jars still contained viable seeds. Not many, but enough for a small planting. Nothing more. Daniel looked at the tiny pile of seeds resting in the palm of his hand. So this is all that's left? Dr. Calloway smiled. If even one plant survives, it won't be all that's left anymore. Spring arrived quietly. Daniel chose a single acre near the north fence. Not the best field, not the worst, just enough land to test what his grandfather had written. Marcus watched from the tailgate of his truck. You really trust instructions written 90 years ago? Daniel laughed. I trust the man who wrote them. Together, they followed the journal. The planting order was unlike anything either brother had ever practiced. Beans beside corn, squash between rows, cover crops where conventional wisdom said there should be bare soil. Marcus frowned more than once. This looks messy. Daniel smiled. Grandpa's fields always did. By early June, nothing remarkable had happened. The plants emerged. They grew steadily. They looked healthy. Marcus couldn't resist. I thought this was supposed to be a miracle. Daniel grinned. If it's a miracle, it's taking its time. Then the rain stopped. 1 week became 2. 2 became 4. By mid-July, Harmon County was facing its driest growing season in more than a decade. Creeks shrank. Ponds receded. Pastures turned the color of straw. Every conversation at Miller's feed store revolved around the same subject, rain, or the lack of it. Farmers walked their fields with worried faces. Leaves curled under the relentless sun. Corn stalks sagged. Wheat heads formed early, desperate to finish before the moisture disappeared completely. Marcus drove out one afternoon without calling. Daniel found him standing silently beside the test plot, looking across the fence. On one side, a neighboring field drooped under the heat, the soil between the rows cracked open. On the other, Daniel's small test plot remained green, not perfect, not untouched, but undeniably healthier. Marcus crossed the fence. He knelt, pressed his fingers into the earth. The soil beneath the companion-planted rows was still cool, still damp. He picked up a handful. It held together. Across the fence, the neighboring soil crumbled into dust. Marcus stood slowly. I don't understand. Daniel looked toward the horizon. Neither did Grandpa. He just kept paying attention. The drought deepened. County officials began warning farmers to prepare for reduced yields. Several producers cut their losses and harvested early. Daniel didn't. He kept following the journal. Every note, every observation, every rotation, every timing adjustment Everett had written in the margins nearly a century earlier. Some evenings, Sarah found him sitting in the barn, reading by lantern light, not because the instructions were difficult, but because they felt like conversations. Across 90 years, a grandfather was still teaching his grandson how to care for the same land. Then came the dust storm. The forecast underestimated it. By late afternoon, the western sky had disappeared behind a wall of brown. Daniel had seen photographs of the Dust Bowl his entire life. Now, for the first time, he understood why people who lived through it never forgot. The wind struck first, then the dust. Within minutes, Daylight faded to an eerie amber glow. Visibility collapsed. Loose topsoil swept across the fields in long rolling waves. Daniel and Sarah watched from the farmhouse porch as the storm swallowed the horizon. Neither of them spoke. Inside the barn, Everett's journal rested safely on the workbench. Outside, his final lesson was being tested. By sunrise, the storm had passed. Daniel drove to the field before breakfast. Marcus was already there. Neither man spoke as they walked the fence line. The neighboring field looked exhausted. Whole sections had flattened. The exposed soil drifted into shallow ridges. Then they reached the test plot. It wasn't untouched. Some leaves had torn. Several plants leaned where the wind had pushed them. But the living cover between the rows had held the soil in place. The earth remained anchored. Marcus crouched again and dug his fingers into the ground. This time he laughed, not loudly, just once, the kind of laugh that escapes when certainty quietly falls apart. He stood, looked across the field, then at his brother. "I owe you an apology." Daniel shook his head. "No, you owe Grandpa one." Marcus smiled. "I think he already heard it." Harvest arrived 6 weeks later. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The single-acre test plot produced nearly 30% more usable grain than the neighboring conventional field, despite receiving the same rainfall. Even more remarkable, it had required less supplemental irrigation. Dr. Calloway checked the figures 3 separate times, then handed the report to Daniel. "You don't have proof of magic," she said, smiling. "You have proof of good science, written by people history forgot to thank." Daniel looked toward the barn standing quietly beyond the fields. For years, everyone had believed the old building was protecting the past. Now he understood, it had been protecting the future. Only one task remained, to make sure the people who had made that future possible were finally remembered. By autumn, the story of the Voss barn had reached far beyond western Kansas, not through headlines claiming a miracle, not through exaggerated tales of mystery seeds, but through something much harder to dismiss. Evidence. Dr. Calloway and her research team spent months documenting every page of Everett's journal, testing the surviving seed varieties, and comparing the results with modern agricultural data. Their conclusion was careful. The journal wasn't a book of miracles. It was the lifelong record of a farmer who had observed, experimented, failed, learned, and, most importantly, given credit where it belonged. When the university published its research, one decision mattered to Daniel more than any other. The paper did not describe the methods as the Voss system. Instead, the title acknowledged what Everett himself had written nearly 90 years earlier, dryland farming practices preserved through the Voss journal and the traditional knowledge of the Redcorn family. For the first time, the people Everett had refused to erase were finally written back into the story. Several months later, members of the Redcorn family were invited to the farm. Daniel wasn't sure what to expect. He worried they might see the journal as something that should never have been hidden. Instead, an elderly woman stood quietly inside the restored barn, reading Everett's handwritten words. When she reached the passage where he credited her family, she closed the journal gently. "My grandfather used to say that knowledge is like seed," she said. "If you keep it only for yourself, it dies. But if you protect it until the right season, it feeds people you've never met." She looked around the barn. Daniel felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he understood that Everett hadn't hidden the truth because he wanted recognition. He had hidden it because he feared the truth would disappear before the world was willing to hear it. The barn was restored that winter, not transformed into a museum, not polished into something unrecognizable. Daniel wanted it to remain what it had always been. A working barn. The weathered beams were strengthened. The roof was rebuilt. The leaning foundation was carefully corrected. But one section remained exactly as it had been discovered. The north wall. A small glass panel was fitted into the restored boards, and behind it the hidden compartment remained visible. Empty now, not because it had lost its purpose, but because it had fulfilled it. Marcus became the first person to volunteer for the restoration. No one asked him to. He simply arrived one Saturday morning with a toolbox and started working. Late that afternoon, the two brothers stood outside the finished wall. Marcus broke the silence. "You know, I used to think that barn was costing us our future." Daniel smiled. "It almost did." Marcus nodded. "But tearing it down would have cost us a lot more." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus laughed. "I guess Grandpa got the last word after all." Daniel smiled toward the north wall. "I think he planned it that way." Boyd Pruitt drove past the farm the following spring. The restored barn stood proudly against the Kansas sky. Children were helping Daniel repair a fence. The test fields stretched beyond them, greener than the year before. Boyd slowed his truck for a moment, then quietly drove on. Some opportunities were never meant to be purchased. Inside the barn, a single-framed photograph hung above Everett's old workbench. It showed him standing in a wheat field during the late 1930s, dust clouds gathering on the horizon. His face wasn't smiling. It wasn't proud. It was peaceful. Beneath the photograph, Daniel had placed a small brass plaque. It didn't mention the discovery, the journal, or the seeds. It simply read, "He listened before he planted." Daniel believed those 5 words explained his grandfather better than any history book ever could. Today, the Voss farm is still worked by the same family. The restored north wall still welcomes visitors. The journal is preserved under archival care, while digital copies are studied by agricultural researchers and students. The surviving seed line continues to be cultivated, not as a relic of the past, but as part of the future. And every year, before planting begins, Daniel walks to the barn. He places his hand against the north wall, just as he has done since he was a boy, not because he expects another secret to appear, but because some habits become a way of saying thank you. People still ask him why he kept the barn for so many years. He always smiles before answering. "I didn't keep the barn because I knew what was inside. I kept it because I trusted the man who asked me to wait." Then he usually looks across the fields and adds one more sentence. "The hardest part of faith is that it almost never comes with an explanation." Maybe that's why this story resonates so deeply. Because most of us have something in our lives that others don't understand, a dream people laugh at, a conviction we can't fully explain, a promise that seems unreasonable. The world will almost always tell you to tear those things down, to choose what's practical, to move on. Sometimes that's the right decision. But sometimes, hidden behind years of doubt, sacrifice, and misunderstanding, is something worth preserving. Not because it's old, not because it's valuable, but because it's true. Daniel Voss didn't save an old barn. He saved a story that honored a grandfather who chose integrity over recognition, a family that shared wisdom without expecting credit, and a simple truth that almost disappeared beneath weathered boards. Some treasures aren't made of gold. Some are made of patience. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what our grandparents leave to us. It's what they trust us to protect for everyone who comes after. The barn is still standing. And thanks to one man's willingness to wait, its story finally is too.